All right, tracts of the spinal cord. These are the things that are going to go up and down. We call them ascending tracts. We have descending tracts of spinal cord, okay? Ascending tracts, are they going to carry sensory or motor? Sensory. Always, always. Descending will carry motor. Okay, so you've got in terms of afferent or efferent, which ones are descending? Efferent. The ones that are going ascending is afferent. Well, there's a neat little mnemonic. AA. Okay. Sometimes the mnemonics just yell at you. Okay. All right. So let's do the tracts. Now, let's first go over some generalizations, terms that we're going to be using with this. The number of synapses, because the nerves are going to synapse with other nerves. A monosynaptic synapse is going from, here's one neuron, and it synapses with another neuron. Monosynaptic, one synapse. Okay? We could have polysynaptic. We're going to have this, where you're going to have two or more synapses. Now be careful of the words here. When I say monosynaptic, how many neurons are we talking about? Monosynaptic. Two. All right? When you take the exams, you're going to see the word mono, and I'm going to ask you how many neurons, and people tend to say one. Do you see where the mix-up is? Just be alert to that. We're counting the number of synapses, not the number of neurons. Okay? We give them names also. This is, and here's the abbreviations. This is a first order neuron. Kind of abbreviate it like that. This is a second order neuron. In this case, this is this first order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron. Okay, just nomenclature here. So a monosynaptic is where we're going to have one neuron up here synapsing with another neuron, and it can go out this way. Monosynaptic is only one synapse. Polysynaptic, going in here, synapse here, another synapse, and going this way. All right? This is not necessarily the spinal cord. This could be any central nervous system, the brain, so to say. Okay? But this is more or less a reflex, as we talked about. We're talking about going up. So you're going to have, if it's going to come from my fingers over here, one will go this way, first order neuron. Someplace in here it's going to synapse, second order neuron, and it may go up to a third order neuron going up. Now let's look at the spinal cord itself. This is just a run-of-the-mill spinal cord. Okay? Doesn't matter what level. We're going to have in red, they're showing these are the ascending tracts. The areas that you'll find ascending tracts. Here they're showing descending tracts in green over here. Okay? Just make sure you understand this concept. They only did this for your teaching purposes to have the green over here and the red over here. That's not how it is. We have red on both sides. They just don't want to mix up the idea of, then you got purples in there when you mix the two. So we have ascending tracts here and ascending tracts here. We got descending tracts here. We got descending tracts here. They're just doing this for the teaching purposes. And we're going to need to know where all these areas are, because on your next exam, the one that has this, you're going to have a cross-section of the spinal cord, and you need to know where these are. But we'll get there. We'll get there. Okay? Ascending sensory, descending motor. Now we have a word called decussation. Crossing over is what it means. Okay? So the origin of that neuron and the destination where it's going to go into the brain or coming from the brain are going to be on opposite sides of the body. Someplace in there it crossed over to the other side. And we're going to talk about that. That's not on my list that I'm going to argue up there. But this actually makes some sense, and you'll see why. It's something we evolved into. So they're on the contralateral side. So decussation, I put this in parentheses just so you don't get mixed up, but ipsilateral means that it's on the origin and destination on the same side. And there's some tracts that do that. But when we talk about decussation, we're talking crossing over, so we're talking about contralateral. So here's where the neuron order are, as I mentioned up there. First, second, third order neurons, depending on how many. And I guess you can also go to fourth order neuron. We won't in this course. We'll just deal with these. Now, the nomenclature of the tracts, for the most part, don't make sense. They're often named by their 2 points, where they begin and where they end. And that's going to give you some clue if they're descending or ascending, i.e. sensory or motor. For instance, we have something called the Spinothalamic Tract. Spinal, what do you think that means? Spinal. Spinal cord, right? What do you think thalamic means? Thalamus. Where's the thalamus located? In the brain. So this is going to go from the spine to the brain. So from the spinal cord to the thalamus. Is that ascending or descending? Is that sensory or motor? Is it afferent or efferent? Do you see what I'm saying? It kind of makes sense. For the most part, that's how they're named. Okay? So this is sensory, and, it says ascending there, but you did that from your brain. You didn't read it up here, right? Okay, good. All right? So there's sensations. We also have something called corticospinal. Cortico, we're going to learn about the brain. Remember how it is, it's the gray surrounding the white in the brain. Well, the gray matter in the brain, the outer cortex, is called the cortex of the brain. The gray matter of the brain is known as the cortex. So this is called cortex, corticospinal tract. So which way do you think this is going? Down, descending. Motor or sensory? Motor, okay? Efferent or afferent? Efferent, okay? They sometimes are referred to, these particular ones, the corticospinals, are sometimes referred to as the pyramidal tracts. The reason why is because the cell bodies in the cortex are known as the pyramid cells. So, if they're the corticospinals, they're also called the pyramidal tracts for that reason. Now, all the other descending tracts, which we're really not going to get into, all the other ones they're referred to as the extra-pyramidal tracts. They're all grouped together. The only pyramidal tracts we have is going to be what we call the corticospinal tracts. All the other descendings, they have names for them, but they could also be grouped as the extra-pyramidal tracts. Okay? We'll talk about the corticospinal tract. Okay? So again, showing this picture. They're showing you the ascending tracts in red. Okay? Spinothalamic tract is in this area here. Corticospinal tract is located here. So you know that these are it's going down. Look at even some of these names. Spinocerebellar tract. Spinocerebellar. Coming from where? Where's the origin? Spine. Where is the destination? Cerebellum. So by the name, you know if it's ascending or descending. Okay? Some exceptions, but because the names are not so easy. But reticulospinal tract. We didn't talk about the reticular area in the brain, but you could figure that out. If you're going to see the word spinal at the end, you know it's going to be descending because it's going down to the spine. Technospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal. You know that's descending. These are also grouped together as the extra-pyramidal tracts. The only one that extra-pyramidal tracts. The only one it's not is the corticospinal, which is a pyramidal tract. Does that make sense about this descending, ascending, and nomenclature? It's not bad. And I'm going extra slow for you for this because it's going to get busy, like any Route 80 or any highway would be. All right, so let's talk about ascending or sensory tracts. Okay? And there's 3 to 4 of these I want you to know. I say 3 to 4 because there's a combination of 2, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But there's only one descending tract I want you to know. So before we talk about the ascending tracts, we've got to talk about the different sensory systems that we have. Pain and temperature. I group these 2 things together because they ride on the same track. Proprioception and stereognosis. That will follow the same track. So what are proprioception and stereognosis? Proprioception is what I told you about, where you're going to close your eyes and point to your nose. Without you even being alert to what you're looking at, you know where parts of your body are. That's proprioception. Stereognosis is, you do this all the time too. If I put this in your hand and your eyes are closed, you're going to be feeling this and you can say, oh, that's a remote control. It's by feel. Without looking at it, you know what you're feeling. Now, obviously, memory has to do with this too, because if you've never seen a remote control, you're not going to get this right. If I put a comb in your hand and you've never seen a comb, you're not going to get that right. So it also deals with memory. Okay? So proprioception is sensing where all your body parts without looking at it, whereas stereognosis is recognizing objects by feel with your eyes closed. Okay? And those follow the same track also. You also have light touch, like a cotton ball on your hand. Okay? We're going to talk about vibration and deep touch, but we'll show you that in a moment. All right, so let's talk about our very first tract, the Spinothalamic Tract. This is going to carry pain and temperature. By the name, it's an ascending tract. Spinal thalamic. It's a 3-neuron or pathway. So we're going to have a first order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron. How many synapses? 2. 1, 2. Okay? And these will cross over too, and you need to know where they cross over. So I'll draw it up on the board. Let me verbalize it for you first. And then I got a picture too. The first order neuron is going to come wherever. From, let's say, your hand, your leg, doesn't matter. It's coming this way and going into the spinal cord. It's going to synapse immediately as it gets into the spinal cord. And it's going to synapse with a second order neuron in the posterior horn, the dorsal horn. All right, we showed that before. Then it's going to cross over immediately to the other side. And then it's going to ascend on the other side. So if I touch something hot over here, first order neuron goes into my spinal cord, synapses with another neuron, and immediately goes on the other side, and it's going to go up my right side. It'll ascend through the brainstem and get into the thalamus, and it's going to synapse with a third order neuron at the thalamus. The thalamus has a lot of relays. Think of it as Grand Central Station. And that's the way you got to look at all these neurons. If you're going to go from California to Boston, you're going to change some state trains. You're going to change some trains at different stations. That's what's happening here. And the thalamus has the greatest amount of train exchanges. Grand Central Station in New York. Okay? Then it's going to move up on the other side like that to the cerebrum. Let me show you something about the cerebrum. Okay? So this is the left side of the brain. Okay? Looks like a boxing glove, right? Your cerebellum's over here, the brainstem's over here. Now, this is the wrinkly part, the cerebrum. There's going to be a deep crevice over here, and this is called the central sulcus. It's going to separate the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe's here and occipital lobe's back here. Frontal lobe is here, parietal lobe is over here. You'll see these in the brains when we get there. There's going to be a gyrus that's going to be anterior to the central sulcus. This gyrus right here in red. That's a part of the frontal lobe. Do you agree? Because it's anterior to the central sulcus. This first gyrus that's in front or anterior to the central sulcus has a special name. It's called the precentral gyrus. There's going to be a gyrus right behind or posterior to the central sulcus. This gyrus. And this is going to be the post-central gyrus. Okay? The precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe. Do you agree? Because the central sulcus separates the two lobes. All the ascending fibers coming from the spinal cord, they're going to go up, and all of them are going to go into the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is going to collect all the data, all the sensory. And then the brain has to figure out what to do with that information. Once the brain figures out what to do with that information, it's then going to send all its information to the precentral gyrus. And the precentral gyrus is then going to send a descending tract to go to those muscles that you can move, to respond to whatever that sensory told it to. Is that clear about this? Now I'm going to show you what's really going to happen by putting a lot of lines here. This picture is going to look very messy. And this is the stuff you just take for granted that goes on in your brain, and you don't have to think about it. But this is what's all going to happen. You have all this ascending tracts going into here. And it's all going to funnel in to the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is then going to have a lot of interneurons, and it's going to send that information all around the brain to figure out what to do with it. You'll learn about that when we get into the brain. Eventually what's going to happen is it's going to be able to process that, figure out what to do with it, and then they say, you know what, that's pain. Okay, you got to tell this part of the brain and say, we got to get the muscles to contract over there. We got to make sure we tell this part of the brain, don't contract these muscles. It's doing all that. So you're going to now have a lot of things that are coming from different areas, and they're all now going to funnel in the precentral gyrus. Which is the frontal lobe. And from the precentral gyrus, it's going to send descending fibers down to those muscles to contract so you could actually respond to that temperature, whatever it is, whatever you're touching. It's very busy. Your brain does this automatically. You take for granted for this, so that you could study and do, smoke your pipe, or you could, you could watch TV, watch a movie, I don't know, whatever you want to do. But this is the stuff that goes on that you don't even think about. Does this make sense? Okay? So, with that said, from the thalamus, it then goes to the postcentral gyrus. Now you know what that is. And that's found in the parietal lobe. It's our sensory center. Okay? Questions on that so far? All right, so let's look at what's going on here. Okay, let's do it over here. Let's say this is your brain. It's kind of a coronal cut. I'm not going to draw it that well. This will be the right side. This will be the left side. Okay? We have over here the spinal cord. We're taking a cross section of it. You're going to look at it like this, and it'll look like this. Okay? We're also going to have over here your hand, and you're touching a candle. That's my best picture of a candle. Okay? In the brain up here, sorry to erase this part over here. In the brain, you're going to have the thalamus. You also have over here this portion here is going to be your brain stem. So this will be brain stem. This will be your thalamus. And the black will be the cerebrum. Going slow. You can visualize. I'm just giving you the highlights of what's going to, that's the players of the this track that's going in. And this is what's going to happen. And let me also show you the division going through here. So that's left side, that's right side. First order neuron comes from our finger. It's going to go this way. Remember, the cell body will be in the dorsal root ganglion. Is going to come into the dorsal horn and immediately synapse with our second order neuron. At the same level where this is coming into the spinal cord, it's going to cross over and enter an area where there's going to be myelination. And will ascend this way. And synapse with our third order neuron. And go to the postcentral gyrus in the brain. I know it looks very busy. First order neuron coming over here. Synapses immediately as it enters the spinal cord with our second order neuron. When it synapses, it's also going to immediately cross over to the other side. And will go up the other side that it originated from. It will eventually synapse in the thalamus with our third order neuron. And will enter the post-central gyrus on the other side. Okay, makes sense? Now, let's talk about a lesion. A lesion is any kind of trauma or any kind of condition that happens to something. And if we do a lesion, a spinal cord lesion to one side, then you're going to lose pain and temperature on the contralateral side of where it happened. For instance, if I have a motor vehicle accident, God forbid, and it's going to sever half of my, or one side of my spinal cord. Now, cancer can go invade into here, and that could be a lesion and destroy that. Tuberculosis can go in here and destroy that. Multiple sclerosis could happen on one side. Motor vehicle accident. Things can happen that way. If one side gets damaged, let's say this side. So he has a spinal cord lesion on the left side. He will not be able to sense pain and temperature on the right side. Do you see it? Because this is all coming from here. If I had some kind of lesion on this side, I could still feel on this side. Does that make sense? It's because they crossed over. Okay with that? So to simplify it, pain and temperature, spinothalamic, going across here, so it synapses and it crosses over immediately and goes up on the opposite side. Your book has something like this. I think it's a bit busy, but it's what I kind of drew over there for you. First order neuron comes on this side, synapses immediately with the second order neuron. It then crosses over on the other side immediately at that same level and ascends up here. This is the medulla. Here's the midbrain. All of this is your brain stem. It goes all the way up until it reaches the thalamus, where it's going to synapse with a third order neuron and go right up to the post-central gyrus. Questions about that? That's number one. It's not hard. It isn't. It's just that you have 4 or 5 and you just can't get them mixed up. But I'll do each one like this. Okay? Questions on that? All right. The dorsal or posterior columns. There's 2 parts to them. There's something called the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. What it basically means is the fasciculus gracilis is going to carry proprios and stereognosis from the lower parts of your body. Below the waistline is the vesiculus gracilis. Cuneatus is anything that's going to come from above the waistline. It's still going to carry the same thing, it's just coming from two different parts. I kind of remember gracilis as a ballerina dances gracefully with her legs. Okay? And then I just remember that. You could also think of cuneatus like cunning, like you're using your wits, right? So something above the waist. Okay? You'll actually use gracilis because there's a muscle in the leg called the gracilis. So that also makes some sense. If you know that already, then you can use that too. So just gracilis, vesiculus gracilis, is dealing with the lower limbs, whereas the vesiculus cuneatus is dealing with above the waist. Okay? Now this is going to carry proprioception, stereognosis, vibration, and deep touch. Pressure will also follow the same lines here. Okay? So this is what's going to happen. It's a 3-neuron pathway, just what we saw over here, but different. The first order neuron enters the posterior horn of the spinal cord. SC is spinal cord. It then is going to ascend, didn't cross over, didn't synapse. It comes into the spinal cord and ascends on the same side that it came over. And it's going to synapse in the brain stem, specifically the medulla. That's where it's going to synapse with a second order neuron. It's going to cross over also in the medulla. And it's going to ascend up through something we call a medial lemniscus. You'll learn about that later. It's just like a little, I guess you could call it like a tunnel in the brain stem. And then it's going to go into the thalamus and synapse with a third order neuron, just the way we saw before. And this is also going to go to the postcentral gyrus. Remember, the postcentral gyrus is going to collect all the sensory. Blue. Okay? So it's basically the same thing I just drew here, the basics. Okay? Now this is what's going to happen here. Okay? Proprioception is going to happen over here. So it's really not a temperature, I don't know, some kind of pressure pressing on here. And we're going to send our first order neuron this way. Cell body still in the dorsal root ganglion. And it's going to go this way and actually goes in here and ascends all the way up, and it's going to synapse in the brain stem. This is the brain stem, the blue here, the thick blue. going to synapse with our second order neuron, cross over, and ascend to the thalamus, where it's going to ascend, or it's going to synapse with our third order neuron, and go up here. Does that make sense? Our first order neuron is coming this way, stays on the same side, does not cross over, does not synapse, and it's going to go up on the same side that it came from. And will synapse in the medulla, which is the brainstem. It will also cross over in the brainstem also, and ascend to the thalamus. Where it's going to synapse with our third order neuron. And that'll go into our postcentral gyrus. Make sense? Yeah? Okay? Now, if we have a spinal cord lesion to one side, all right, it's just saying here, fasciculus gracilis is going to be conveying sensory from the lower body, and the cuneatus is going to come from a sensory from the upper body, which I explained to you. A spinal cord lesion will happen on the same side. Look what's going to happen here. I'm going to do a lesion here, but I'm going to do it on this side here. So if there's some kind of lesion that happens on one side here, whatever that is, tuberculosis, cancer, trauma, then you're not going to be able to feel deep touch, proprioception, vibration, stereognosis on the same side, because it didn't cross over yet. Does that make sense? It's on the same side. Here it's on the other side because it crossed over at a lower area. Okay? So the lesion affects the same side, ipsilateral. So, kind of like how I drew here, it goes up on the same side. This is where it's kind of showing you where the medulla is. It crosses over the medulla and ascends to the thalamus on the other side. This is what your book has. Okay, it's coming in this way, ascends on the same side, but now this is the medulla. It synapses with the second order neuron and crosses over at the medulla also, and ascends into the thalamus where it synapses with the third order neuron. It's just taking trains from here to someplace else. So think of it that way as your analogy. It's not bad. Okay? This is what you're conscious about. Proprioception, you're conscious. If someone told you to touch your nose over here, someone told you that, you're conscious about that. But other things that you're not conscious about. All right? Things that, like, if you're walking and unconsciously you know that someone's over here, so you know you don't want to, go towards that person and bump into them. You know what I'm saying? So it's knowing where your body is. So we have a conscious and unconscious component. The conscious is what you just saw. This. That's the conscious one. The unconscious connects with the cerebellum. And this one's pretty easy. I won't even draw it up there. It's called the Spinocerebellar Tract. The name tells you it's ascending from the spine to the cerebellum. This allows us to walk and perform other complex things subconsciously without having to think about what joints are flexed or extended. Right? When you're walking and talking, or you're walking and playing, I don't know, Pokemon Go or whatever, all right? You're doing this and you're not thinking what muscles you're contracting to walk. And you're forgetting about the person in front of you or the car in front of you, hint, hint, okay? So the spinocerebellar is ipsilateral. It does this. It comes in and goes to the same side. It's a pretty easy one to manage. You don't have to worry about synapses and stuff, at least for the way I'm teaching it. But that's, we're dealing with the cerebellum. It's going on the same side. That's unconscious. General rule of thumb is cerebellar lesions are ipsilateral, whereas cerebral lesions tend to be contralateral. What I've been showing you is spinal cord lesions. Well, what if you had a stroke to your cerebrum? If I have a stroke to my cerebrum, a stroke is a decreased amount of oxygen to that part of the brain. If I have a stroke, so I have a cerebral lesion that happens here, then I'm not going to be able to move this side. I'm not going to be able to feel on the opposite side because I got, does that make sense? The opposite side. But if I had a stroke to the cerebellum, then the unconscious is going to be affected on the same side. Does that make sense? It's all about strokes. Okay? Spinothalamic Tracts, posterior columns. It's the combination of those two that give you light touch. Okay? It's a 3 neural pathway, combination of the 2 tracts. If you understand those two, it's this. All right? It enters the spinal cord. Part of it will cross over immediately. Part of it won't. It'll go up the same side. Part of it crosses over. Part of it stays on the same side. Reaches the brainstem, and the rest of it will cross over in the brainstem. Doesn't matter. Either way, they're both on the opposite side when we get to the point of where it enters the cerebrum, or the postcentral gyrus. Spinal cord lesion. When we're dealing with light touch, it's usually spared. This is the rationale. This is the significance why we have crossing over. If you have a spinal cord lesion over here on this side, well, part of the light touch is on the other side. So it's usually spared because you still have some kind of touch with light touch, because only part of it crossed over in the spinal cord. The other part is going to cross over much higher. And if you had a spinal cord lesion at the spinal cord, half of it would have, with the brainstem, it would have never been affected. This crossing over allows us to do a lot of different things when it's not completely dead. In other words, if I have, God forbid, a stroke on my right side of my brain, I'm not going to have total weakness. I'm not going to have total sensation destroyed on one side because there's crossing over. It's not going to be totally dead weight. Does that make sense? It's an evolutionary thing that we've developed. It allows us to, crossing over allows us not to be totally dead over there on that side, but have weakness. Does that make sense? All right, and some touch. You might have pins and needles, but it's not going to be like completely numb. Now, granted, you cut right through the spinal cord, yes. But on one side, no. Okay? And we don't have anything, I'll be honest with you, there's nothing that really will slice this in half. It usually takes a banana, if that's a spinal cord, and crush it. You can't put those tracts back together. It's impossible. Okay? At least today's day and age. I'm being recorded, but who knows? They might look at this, let's say, 50 years from now and say, can you believe that? What do you mean you can't suture that kind of stuff? Right now, in 2016, we cannot suture crushed spinal cords. Okay? So it's a combination. Part of it will cross over immediately and go up. Part of it will go up on the same side and cross over and the brainstem and go on the other side. Either way, by the time it gets up to the cerebrum, it's going to be on the other side. That's why if I have a stroke to this part of the brain, I'm not going to be able to deal with light touch on that side. Okay, does that make sense? So, what we have here, okay, I showed you this, that's the only ascending fibers I want you to know, ascending tracts. Okay? The gracilis is going to be located here. So the dorsal columns, as you learned, dorsal columns is here, posterior columns. This is where the fasciculus gracilis is going to be. Fasciculus cuneatus is going to be over here too. It'll be more lateral, but it's still in the dorsal columns. The spinocerebellar will be in this area here. This whole area, we'll just say. Don't worry about dorsal or ventral. We didn't get into that. But just the spinocerebellar is here, and the spinothalamic will be in here. It's on the other side too. So spinothalamic's here. The gracilis or fasciculus gracilis is here. Fasciculus cuneatus is over here, and the spinocerebellar will be over here too. It's on both sides. It's just it would be too confusing to see. So those are our ascending tracts. Okay. So the descending tracts, which are motor, right? It would make sense. The only one we really have to be concerned about is the lateral corticospinal tracts. And you could just refer to this as the corticospinal tract. As the name implies, cortical, the cerebral cortex, to the spine, corticospinal tract. This is what's going to control all conscious movement, i.e. your skeletal muscles. Okay? This is all going to come from the precentral gyrus, which is in what lobe of the brain? Frontal. Good, frontal. Okay? This is after your brain has collected all that information from ascending fibers, going through all different interneurons to figure out what, as it's processing all this information, and then it finally funnels into the precentral gyrus and connects with the corticospinals and sends it down to move that muscle. This is conscious movement. A two neural pathway. Okay? So you have a first order neuron and a second order neuron. How many synapses do we have? One. It does cross over, but there's only one synapse. A monosynaptic pathway. The first order neuron leaves this motor area of the cerebrum, which is the precentral gyrus. of the frontal lobe. Bless you. It then descends and crosses over at the medulla. And then it's going to descend on that opposite side. And just before it leaves the spinal cord, it's going to meet up with the second order neuron in the anterior horn of the spinal cord and extends out that way to wherever it needs to go. So let's draw it again. Okay. Same kind of picture. Okay? So what's going to happen here, this is descending. So it's going to go, start from, and again, this is right, left, right, left. It's going to start in the pre-central gyrus. And the cell bodies will be in there. Those cell bodies are called the pyramidal cells. It's going to go down. Doesn't really pass, well, yeah, passes through the thalamus. When it gets to the medulla, okay, so this is the medulla, brainstem. It's going to cross over and go down on the opposite side through the spinal cord. Hold on. Really does that. All right. It's then going to synapse in the anterior horn of the spinal cord with our second order neuron. And that's going to go out and is going to move that hand. Okay? Two order neurons. First order neuron coming from the precentral gyrus is going to go down through the brain into the brain stem. The medulla is going to cross over at the medulla and will descend on the opposite side that it began with. It's then going to synapse in the anterior horn the gray horn, anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And will synapse with a second order neuron at that place. Will pass through the ventral root of the spinal nerve and go out to that muscle that it intends to move. Okay? Now, two terms. Since we're only dealing with two neurons here, first order neuron and second order neuron, they have another name too. Nothing too hard to manage. We just happen to call this one the upper motor neuron. We call the second order neuron the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron is the first order neuron. It's going to begin in the precentral gyrus and goes all the way, that's a long neuron. It goes all the way down to wherever it needs a synapse in the spinal cord. If it's going to just go to here, it's, move your arm, then it's there. If it's going to move your leg, then it goes a little bit further. It's going to synapse there in the anterior horn with our lower motor neuron, or i.e. our second order neuron. And that's going to go from there out in the peripheral area. It's part of the peripheral nervous system. So conscious movement, our skeletal muscle, starts at the precentral gyrus, goes down into the, when it passes through the brainstem, more specifically the medulla, it crosses over to the other side. And once it gets into wherever that spinal cord you want it to go out of, it's going to synapse with our second order neuron or our lower motor neuron, and it goes out there. This is what your book has. They're actually putting both of them in there where they cross over and stuff. Okay? Now, a spinal cord lesion on one side. It's going to be the upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron lesion is affected here. At least it's prior to where it synapses. Anywhere in here. They usually have a few things going on there. They get spastic paralysis. They can't move their arm, but it's spastic. It stays like that, contracted. Can't move it, it's spastic. They usually have hyperreflexia. You tap on their knee, boing, it goes up really fast. Hyper, okay? And I wanted to ask you this, but they don't have what we call fasciculations. In other words, they don't move like that. Every once in a while, they'll jerk like that, okay? For a lower motor neuron lesion, they have flaccid paralysis. You lift it up, it doesn't stay like that. Okay? They have hyporeflexia, meaning you tap their knee and it's very little movement happens there. Okay? And they have the fasciculations. I want to ask you about that. Okay? So, just showing you over here, 3 different ones. Okay? This is our, and I'm going to abbreviate for you, this is the Spinothalamic Tract. Okay? This is going to be your dorsal columns. This is going to be your cortical spinal tract. So you only have to worry about one descending, and then there's more than, because remember, there's I didn't put the one up here, the spinocerebellar, but that all happens on one side, so that's another one, but it's not up here. And then the one for light touch is a combination between the two of these. Does that make sense? All right? So other descending tracts, I wouldn't ask you about them, but you should be able to recognize if it's descending or ascending. Technospinal, you know the spinal is the end of the road. Reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, you know these are all descending. These are also known as the extra-pyramidal tracts because they're not the corticospinal ones. Remember, the corticospinal is referred to as the pyramidal tract. All the other descending tracts are grouped together as the extra-pyramidal. These are just three other ones. There's a whole slew of tracts. You guys want me to go through any other tracts? Curious about any other ones? No? Okay. All right, this is good enough, right? Enough to make you appreciate that our bodies are pretty complex. Okay. So these are just other ones if you want. If you really have an interest, there's some other ones on here. But I gave you the more pertinent ones, or the ones the ones that are usually taught in a class like this. Okay? So, again, you got this whole thing, the spinal cord. The dorsal columns are located in this area. All right? Right up here is showing these ascending tracts. So, here's the dorsal columns. Over here is going to be the spinocerebellar. Over here is the spinothalamic. Over here is the corticospinal. You don't have to worry about these green ones over here. Remember, the corticospinal could also be located here. It's on both sides. Just did this for schematic view. Okay? So there's a summary of all the ones we just did. Okay? Looks busy when you put all the other parts of the body here. So that's the lateral, or we could just call the spinothalamic. It immediately crosses over the other side and continues up on the other side it came from. The dorsal columns come this way and cross over at the medulla and enter the other side that way. And the corticospinal tracts will begin on one side, cross over at the medulla, go to wherever it needs to, exit the spinal cord, and go out that way. This can get busy. Now remember, I just showed you one over here, but you do realize that there is more of these greens going up and down on all these things because you have different levels of your body, whether you want to move this finger, this finger, you want to feel something here, feel something there. It's a busy highway in the spinal cord. There's hundreds and thousands of cars running up and down that spinal cord. I only showed you by putting one up here so I wouldn't confuse you. But it's very, very busy. Okay? Questions about the tracts? We did its justice?